Welcome back to Logic Basics. Today we're going to define knowledge. This is one of my favorite topics. If you have the chance, you can go to my website. I have some podcasts there, and one podcast recently done is What is Knowledge? And today we're just going to go over a handout that I have prepared, and we're going to cover some of the basics of the definition of knowledge. We could do more, but let's start with this. All right, so what is knowledge? Have you wondered this? Remember, it's contrasted with skepticism. Skepticism says nobody could really know. So we're asking now, what does it mean to know? What is knowledge? What is this reality knowledge? Now, we use this word knowledge very loosely. We use it for a lot of things. So let's talk about that first. What we're interested in philosophy and in logic is called propositional knowledge. Propositional knowledge is understanding the meaning of a judgment, S is P, affirming the content of that judgment, and having logical, inferential support for the truth claim of the judgment. For example, I know something is eternal. And you can say, okay, well, how do you know that? So here's a judgment. Something is eternal. It's a judgment. It's a propositional judgment. It has content, beliefs, right? It's cognitive. So something is eternal is like S is P. And we can give an argument for it. So propositional knowledge is the kind of judgment you can give an argument to support. So we had that argument, something is eternal, a few discussions ago when we were talking about skepticism. All right, so propositional knowledge, judgments that can be supported by reason. All right, the second way we use the word knowledge is knowledge by acquaintance. Knowledge by acquaintance is direct or non-inferential knowledge. It's sense perception of a thing or the properties of a thing. For example, the taste of a lemon or the smell of a rose or the color blue. These are things we know by being acquainted with them. But guess what? Whereas propositional knowledge is the kind of knowledge we can share with one another. It's objective. We could give reasons. Knowledge by acquaintance isn't necessarily objective, and it isn't necessarily shared. It's something non-cognitive, let's say. The smell of a rose isn't about a belief, it's about an experience, right? The color of blue, I have no idea how you experience the color blue. We can come to an approximation of it. What about people who are colorblind? So these rely on our faculties, our sense perceptions, and it relies on the condition of the perceiver, like common sense. So knowledge by acquaintance is not what we're concerned with in philosophy. It's something we talk about, but it's not the kind of knowledge we're pursuing. All right, there's another way we use knowledge. Knowledge that, sometimes know-how. Knowledge that is the comprehension of some fact. For example, I know that today is Tuesday. Okay, that's a fact. That may be objective. It may be something we can share, but it doesn't go much further than that. Like, I know that today is Tuesday. What does that do for us? It's not a belief per se. And know-how is the comprehension of how to execute a task. For example, I know how to ride a bicycle. These are ways we use the word knowledge, but they're not the relevant definitions of knowledge for philosophy and for the context of our discussion in the logic class. We want propositional knowledge. All right, so there's a couple other things I should get into. This is maybe geeky philosophy stuff, but sometimes philosophers talk about a priori and a posteriori knowledge. A priori knowledge is propositional knowledge that is independent of sense perception, things that we know by definition. Or possibly things that are innate, that we're born with. Here's an a priori proposition. All bachelors are unmarried men. This is true by definition, right? A posteriori knowledge is propositional knowledge that is dependent upon the senses. So one is dependent on reason alone, and one is dependent upon the senses. So here's an example of a posteriori knowledge. The sun is shining today. The only way to know that is by going outside and looking, right? All right, so these are some things you may come across. It may be in the textbooks that we're using. Now, we want a definition of knowledge, and actually I have a slide prepared where I'm going to compare and contrast two definitions. So if you look at number 5, in attempting to define propositional knowledge, Plato says that knowledge is true belief with an account. Today, philosophers define knowledge as justified true belief. The definition of knowledge may be stated more formally by saying this: a person S knows a proposition P if and only if P is true, S believes P, and S is justified in believing that P. All right, so this is an area that I've been studying for about 20 years. And to be honest, I think philosophers have led us into skepticism by trying to define knowledge in a certain way where justified true belief leads us down a path that doesn't ever deliver knowledge. And so I'm going to show you a slide that I've made. It's on my website, and I use this for that talk I referred to. So here's my slide, and I compare two definitions of knowledge on this slide. Let's look at the first one. This is Plato's definition. Now, Plato has a dialogue named the Theaetetus, and this is a dialogue I may have mentioned before where Socrates is arguing against the position of the sophists. Remember them? They're the ones that think we can't know, but you can use rhetoric to get what you want. Now, Socrates is talking to a young man named Theaetetus in that dialogue, and they come up with this definition of knowledge. Knowledge is true opinion with an account. All right, they agree that knowledge is cognitive, which means it has to do with beliefs, not like knowledge by acquaintance or know-how. It is beliefs that we have. And they talk about, all right, let's try to define true. True is what accords with reality. Now, there are some philosophers that call this definition into question. That's probably a conversation for another time. But truth is something that is objective, not subjective. That's also controversial, right? True is something that we can get at together through the dialogue, according to Socrates. Opinion is something that I just believe. It could be a false belief. Like, my opinion is that onions are not tasty food. Onions are bad. That's my opinion, right? That's neither true nor false. My opinion is that philosophy is a worthy pursuit. Okay, that's getting a little more objective. It could be true that philosophy is a worthy pursuit, but that's where I need to give you an account. Why is philosophy a worthy pursuit? All right, so my opinion is that the good is knowledge. Now, it may be true that the good is knowledge, but we have to give you an account for saying the good is knowledge. So an account is reasons. So an account is by means of a logos. Logos is the Greek word for reasons, and this logos is what guarantees our belief is true. All right, it's objective. A logos or a reason is objective, and it's shared. I give you my reason, you either accept it or reject it, and you give me the reasons why I'm mistaken. Argument and counter-argument. A logos certifies we have a true belief. It makes it guaranteed. And for Plato, an account via a logos is reason and argument, such that the opposite is impossible. And I think the handout that I provided has that as well. Now, Edmund Gettier is a contemporary, maybe he's older than contemporary now. I'm going to move this over just a little bit. Edmund Gettier is let's call him a philosopher that is contemporary. He's discussed contemporarily right now. He looks at Plato, and he thinks Plato says knowledge is justified true belief. Oops. He thinks a true opinion is the same as a true belief, and an account is by justification for Gettier. Now, what is that? He agrees that knowledge is cognitive, and he says that justification is sensory data, or he doesn't say this actually. You have to infer this from his examples. Justification is sensory data or testimony, and testimony is what other people tell you. Sense data or testimony can be mistaken. This is me saying this now. It can be mistaken, misunderstood, ambiguous, or dependent upon our cognitive function or our environment. Justification is thus not sufficient for knowledge. Justification at best provides high probability for truth. So I'm going to go back to the handout and explain this difference between Plato and Gettier just a little bit more. So let's return to the handout where we went through this definition. Yeah, justified true belief, and what is this? So let's go over this again. I'm going to accept this definition, justified true belief, for Plato and Gettier, and then we're going to modify it. All right, so what does it mean to have a belief? To have a belief, because we're asking, what does this mean? What does belief mean? What does true mean? What does justified mean? Okay, that's what we do before we say, yes, that's a good definition. We say, what does it mean? All right, to have a belief is to have a mental affirmation of a proposition. So what does it feel like when you believe something? What does it feel like from the inside? The example I often use in class is this one. I believe my car is in the parking lot. Okay, my car is in the parking lot is a judgment, and I'm affirming it, right? My car is in the parking lot. I believe that. I affirm that, right? Now, truth is what corresponds with reality. So for that statement, my car is in the parking lot, that's a proposition. For that proposition to be true, it has to match the way the world is. So for it to be true, my car has to actually be in the parking lot, right? So a true statement matches reality. So my car is in the parking lot is the belief. It's true if the car is actually there in the parking lot. I know this concept of truth is tricky these days. We often talk about, oh, that's my truth, or subjective truth versus objective truth. True for me versus true, capital T. So we're looking for capital T true. True, that's the way the thing is out there. So when we say, what is X? We're asking for the truth of the matter. I once had someone tell me that we can't look for capital T true, only little t true, only your truths. And I thought, well, then I guess we can't do philosophy anymore, because that's what philosophy is looking for. That's what Socrates is looking for when he says, what is justice? What is beauty? He's asking for the reality of it. What is it? What is the truth of the matter about justice? I'll also add, it seems like if we don't have truth, we can't have justice. Truth and justice are connected, but that's a different topic altogether, right? That's ethics. All right, so you may have questions about correspondence, theory of truth. I would say look into it, think about it, look it up, think critically. Okay, now I'm going to jump. Actually, I'm just going to tell you about Edmund Gettier. Let's jump down here to 11. Edmund Gettier, he gives a lot of counterexamples. So Edmund Gettier, through his counterexamples, challenges the sufficiency of justification for knowledge. Edmund Gettier wrote a little paper called Is Justified True Belief Knowledge? And in this paper, he says knowledge is justified true belief, but there are problems with this definition. And he gives what are called Gettier examples. They've come to be called Gettier examples. If you Google history of the Gettier examples, you can find hundreds of these. I'll give you my favorite one. But this is also sort of torture to students, I have to admit. It was torture to me when I was a student, so it may be torture for you as well. But let me give you my favorite example. It goes like this. Imagine you're out walking and you see a sheep on the hill, and you form the belief there's a sheep on the hill. And I'm going to add, maybe you smell sheep, maybe you hear the bleating of sheep, as well as seeing what you think is a sheep. Well, in Gettier's example, you aren't actually seeing a sheep, you see a sheep-shaped rock. But behind the sheep-shaped rock is a real sheep. So you form this belief, you walk away believing there's a sheep on the hill, you have all this evidence for a sheep being on the hill, so you're justified. And it's true, there's a sheep on the hill. But then Gettier says, but we don't have knowledge in this example because it's a sheep-shaped rock, not a real sheep when you form the belief. So he doesn't actually give this example. This is somebody else's, I think, Roderick Chisholm's example. But there are many of these examples where our perceptions are deceiving us in some way. Now, after Gettier writes this paper, a number of epistemologists are thrown into a tizzy. Oh my gosh, we can't have knowledge. And so we end up in skepticism. Well, Alvin Plantinga is a Christian philosopher who wants to avoid that skepticism. He may fall into the pitfall of fideism. He does fall into the pitfall of fideism, but he is going to respond by saying that, hey, maybe justification isn't even necessary for knowledge. So Gettier says justification isn't sufficient. We need something more than justified true belief. Plantinga says, hey, we don't even need justification. He redefines knowledge as warranted true belief. He says knowledge is warranted true belief. And a belief is warranted when it is formed by cognitive faculties that are functioning properly in an appropriate environment according to a good design plan. So notice these four things. Cognitive faculties functioning properly in a good environment where, let's say, brains were meant to work, and according to a good design plan. Now, there's going to be a circular argument here. Well, how do you get a good design plan? Well, it's designed to be that way. So human beings are designed by a designer, God, to form the beliefs that they do form. And the beliefs that we form that are warranted are things like the material world exists, there are other minds, my memory beliefs are generally reliable, and God exists. Yeah, but what about people who don't believe in God? Well, then there's cognitive malfunction. So he thinks that if your cognitive faculties are functioning properly, you will naturally come to the belief in God. Now, I want to back up just a little bit and say he does think that there are such things as defeaters to belief in these things that you find yourself spontaneously believing in. For example, let's say I spontaneously form the belief there's a God, and I meet an atheist, and the atheist says, I don't believe there's a God. Now there's a challenge to my belief in God, and the atheist maybe has an argument. Maybe it's the problem of evil. So now I have a defeater for my belief in God from this person who doesn't believe in God. And now I have to give a defeater to that person. But that person could give a defeater. And now I have to come up with a defeater. And this could go on forever, right? So Plantinga doesn't really get us out of the problem of knowledge and justified true belief. So we need to come up with a response to both Gettier, who challenges the sufficiency of justification, and Plantinga, who challenges the necessity of justification. All right, so how are we going to do that? We're going to go back up here and talk about justification, and we're going to talk about justification as Plato does, and justification as Gettier and Plantinga do, and see that we're talking about two different things here. So let's go back. What is justification? We said justification is that piece that guarantees we have a true belief. It ties it down for Plato. So let's talk about two ways to define justification, two definitions. One we'll call weak justification or prima facie justification. Weak justification is sensory data that leads to a high probability of truth. For example, let's say I form the belief that my car is in the parking lot based on my looking out the window a little while ago and seeing the car in the parking lot. If I saw my car in the parking lot, it's highly probable that the car is in the parking lot, right? So when I form that belief, my car is in the parking lot, it's probably true. But notice there's a possibility that it's not. So we hold on loosely to these weakly justified beliefs. We only believe to the extent that we have justification. So these are weak justifications. We hold on loosely to these beliefs. And probably this is good enough for everyday stuff, like my car in the parking lot, what I had for breakfast. But for big beliefs, philosophical beliefs, especially the kind Socrates is looking for, requires more. It requires strong justification. So here's a definition that would be more like Plato's definition. Strong justification is by reason and argument such that the opposite is impossible. This is going to lead to indubitability. It's going to certify we have a true belief. So strong justification is by reason and argument such that the opposite is impossible. Remember when we gave the argument something must be eternal? We did that by showing some is eternal because the opposite, nothing is eternal, leads to a contradiction. And this is the argument ad absurdum we mentioned. And this is what Socrates is often doing, reducing positions to absurdity, meaninglessness, showing that's impossible. It violates a law of thought. So that's what we want for philosophical beliefs, big ones. Like, does God exist? We want strong justification for that. Why? Because if God does exist, then there's moral accountability for knowing that. There's maximum penalties. I mean, people talk about eternal damnation for this kind of thing, failing to believe in God if there is a God. So if there's maximal penalty, there should be maximal clarity and maximal argument for that, right? So big, important philosophical positions require strong justification. And things about the good too. What is the good? Well, do you want the good is probably X, or do you want the good is necessarily X? Okay, now some people tell me, oh, we could never have knowledge. Okay, have you tried? Have you tried to know, and have you tested that assumption? All right, now let's go to the next one. 9 says, to believe the conclusion of a sound argument because the argument is seen as sound is to possess knowledge. All right, now this logic study is about arguments. Ultimately, we're going to be seeing how to construct sound arguments. So once we are presented with a sound argument, we should commit to the conclusion. And if we think the argument is unsound, we should show where it's unsound and give a counter-argument. That's how philosophy proceeds. Argument, counter-argument. Not falling into informal fallacies, not name-calling, not slander, not lawsuits, argument and counter-argument. All right. These 3 conditions of justified true belief are said to be necessary and sufficient for knowledge. These conditions have been challenged, as I mentioned, as being neither necessary nor sufficient, and that's where we discussed Plantinga and Gettier, and we're going to say that the challenge to the necessity and sufficiency of knowledge may be addressed by understanding an ambiguity in the condition of justification. Gettier is going to say it's through sense data or through testimony. Plantinga is going to accept that. Plato, on the other hand, is going to reject that and say it's by reason and argument. So we gave 2 ways of defining justification to satisfy both camps and both kinds of approaching the world, through our senses or through reason. All right, now, you may have questions about knowledge. I encourage you to think critically about this. This may be a topic you want to pursue further. I would encourage you to read up on it. Maybe go read Gettier's little paper. It's online. Maybe read something by Plantinga. But think critically. Also read the Theaetetus by Plato. Please, that would be the best thing to do. All right, here are questions that you should be able to answer at the end of this discussion. What is propositional knowledge? What is knowledge by acquaintance? What is the difference between a priori and a posteriori knowledge? And what is the formal definition of knowledge? Knowledge is justified true belief, and we talked about 2 kinds of justification. weak and strong justification, you should be able to explain both of those. All right, now from here, we're going to see what can we know. We're going to start getting into concepts, judgments, and arguments, and doing a little more logic. All right, look forward to it.